Chapter 12, Comparative Labor Relations. Comparative labor relations is the study of labor relations systems in different countries. This study is important for three reasons. Considering labor relations in multiple countries provides a rich basis for thinking broadly about the underlying problem of balancing efficiency, equity, and voice. From a public policy viewpoint, it can provide ideas on how to reform the U.S. system. From a practical standpoint, if your organization does business in another country, or for a union that has an alliance with a union in another country, it is important to understand that country's labor relation framework. It is important to remember that labor relations in each of these countries takes place within a labor relations environment that includes legal, economic, and social political dimensions that vary from country to country. However, fundamental issues of labor relations are constant across all countries. The objective of the employment relationship is to still find the balance between efficiency, equity, and voice. Canada. Canada has a similar labor structure to the United States. Canadian labor law is structured after the U.S. Wagner Act. There are some noticeable differences between the two countries. Canadian law makes it easier to establish and maintain a union. Unlike the potentially lengthy process in America, some Canadian provinces provide check card recognition and instant elections that happen within days of filing the election petition. Canada's legal jurisdiction is decentralized, unlike the United States. Provinces have similar yet unique laws that govern labor relations. Most provinces ban strike replacements. Canadian unions are moving towards a social unionism philosophy in which labor has a more militant social activist role. Mexico. Mexican law provides strong protections for workers and unions. Mexico was the first constitution to explicitly include workers' rights. The legal protections for workers and unions are much greater in Mexico than the United States, at least on paper. The extent of enforcement is questionable. Labor negotiations and unions have traditionally been controlled by the government as part of a larger economic development strategy. This sometimes creates a clash between independent unions and the government because different focuses come at the expense of democracy and working conditions. For 50 years, the most influential union federation was the Confederation of Mexican Workers. It was closely related to the longtime ruling party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. Therefore, this was often criticized as making the labor movement subservient to the government. This pattern creates lots of potential for abuse within Mexico. Government approves ghost unions, which works with an employer for a bargaining contract that does not grant workers any benefit. Recently, Mexico has gone through volatile elections that have not done much to help improve the labor relations. Globally, unions from other countries have called upon Mexico to stop repression of independent labor unions. Great Britain. Great Britain illustrates the important concept of voluntarism. Unlike the US and Canada, in which the law requires unions and companies to negotiate, collective bargaining in Great Britain has traditionally occurred only if the parties agreed. Voluntary refers to the absence of legal force. Labor and management use the economic power, not legal rights, to work with the other side. Management will agree to bargain because of the economic cost of refusing to, such as strikes or poor morale, are greater than the cost of bargaining. Contracts are not legally enforceable. Voluntarism can be traced back to the 19th century. The British labor relations are still regulated. The Trades Dispute Act facilitates voluntarism by making labor unions immune from being sued for breach of contract for striking. In the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher passed conservative legislation. British unions are currently facing similar issues to those in the United States. Both are seeing a decline in union density. The British decline began much later and stems from the economic changes as well as the previous legislation passed. Another issue is with public policy. Unions' power has been weakened with legal reform. British Labour is looking towards the EU as a method for achieving labour relations that favors workers and their representatives. Finally, in a voluntaristic system, finding a balance among efficiency, equity, and voice largely depends on the markets and the economic leverage of both parties. Ireland. Ireland has similar labor relations to British labor relations. Ireland includes social partnership on top of its voluntaristic labor relations system. A social partnership of labor, business, and the government results in a series of peak-level agreements on social and economic issues. Peak-level organizations are the highest national groups representing the public, the employees, and the employers. Representing the public would be the government. Representing labor would be the major union federation. And representing the employers would be the major employers association. These organizations are integrated into the political decision-making process. France. Labor relations in France includes a mix of militant, often politically oriented unions, but weak collective bargaining. Unlike the US emphasis on business unionism, the French union federations often have distinct political perspectives. France is an example of ideological unionism. In this, French unions pressure the government to enact policies favorable to the union's agendas rather than participating directly in policy making. Since the 1980s, collective bargaining and workplace representation have increased importance. The bargaining takes place on three levels: multi-industry, which it covers working time and flexibility; industry, pay; and company, specific pay and working conditions. Despite low union density, the percentage of workers covered by collective bargaining agreements is high. Germany. Labor relations in Germany has two parts: co-determination and sector bargaining. Unlike France, Germany has one dominant federation that accounts for over 80% of German union membership and has 8 affiliated unions, each of which represents a specific industry. Each major industry has a dominant employer association and union, and they engage in sector bargaining. Sector bargaining is industry-wide bargaining that produces a contract for an entire sector. Sector bargaining often takes place at a regional level, but it is tightly coordinated by the national organizations. Centralized collective bargaining is completed by co-determination, an institutionalized system of employee voice in which employees are entitled to participate in workplace decision-making. Co-determination has two parts: a works council and employee representation on corporate supervisory boards. A works council is a workplace-level committee of employees elected to represent all employees in dealing with management. In practice, union members are likely to be active in the work councils, and unions have helped provide training and expertise. In return, unions can use the rights granted to the work councils to strengthen their influence within the workplace. Work councils are viewed as supportive of workplace changes. Granting co-determination rights to the work councils means that a company must jointly determine issues pertaining to work roles and discipline, as well as other important topics. German supervisory boards are less powerful than the US boards of directors, but employee representation gives workers a voice in strategic decisions. Sweden. Sweden is very similar to Germany. It has a high contract coverage rate and a dual representation structure with centralized industry-wide collective bargaining and strong workplace representation. The major difference is in Sweden has been institutionalized by culture and tradition in the form of strong workplace-level unions. Like the US, Sweden relies on unions. Unlike the US, Sweden has a high union density, more than 70%. Traditional goal of Swedish labor movement was solidaristic wage policy. Eastern Europe. In Stalinist unionism, centrally planned Stalinist economies, managers of state-owned enterprises and unions were both controlled by the government. Unions were a critical part of this economic and political system. primarily to transmit the Communist Party's agenda to the working class. The Solidarity movement of the 1980s is an example of a deviation from the strict Stalinist model. 1991 dissolved the Soviet Union into Russia and other independent states. The Solidarity movement helped trigger this, which underscores the power of collective action and the need for independent labor movements in society. These new countries are struggling with the transition to free markets and democracy. Unions have struggled to find their most effective roles in their new transitional economies. The Stalinist model left behind a legacy of weak unions at the enterprise and workplace levels with no experience in collective bargaining. Thus, collective bargaining is still often conducted with the government, and wage settlements reflect political power rather than economic conditions and bargaining tactics. Australia. Australia's unions are traditionally organized mostly on craft or occupational basis. A main feature of labor relations in Australia has been a centralized system of arbitration awards. In this award system, a federal or state arbitration commission issues an award that specifies the minimum standards for pay and working conditions. This dates back to the early 1900s and was devised to prevent strikes. In the 1980s, Australian labor relations pushed away from centralized awards towards greater decentralization and enterprise-level bargaining. This push is the product of government and employers due to globalization. However, in 2007, with a new government, many of the changes in the 80s were reversed in an attempt to restore some of the equity and voice that were lost in the pursuit of efficiency from the previous administration. Japan. The primary feature of Japanese labor relations is enterprise unionism. Enterprise unionism represents only workers in a single company. This dominant type of enterprise unionism in Japan represents all regular employees, not part-time or temporary. Union density is roughly 20%, but there are more than 50,000 unions. The system of enterprise unionism is embedded in a broader system of human resource management structured around lifetime employment, seniority, firm-based wages, and broad job classification. The Japanese system is an important contrast to the United States labor relations. The two countries share similar labor law framework. In fact, Japanese labor law was established after World War II and is based on the U.S. model of using unfair labor law practices to support employee rights to organize and bargain. Because of the economic success of Japan in the recent decades, the cooperative model of the Japanese labor relations, with high levels of employee participation and union concern for firm profitability, is often advocated as a model for U.S. labor relations. Some argue that the U.S. unions should be more cooperative and do more to enhance productivity and quality. Asian developing countries. The history of labor relations in the developing countries of Asia parallel the major concerns in other countries. The U.S. labor relations system has evolved from a mid-20th century emphasis on economic growth through industrial peace to a 21st century struggle with competitiveness through flexibility. The developing countries of Asia have taken different approaches in designing specific labor systems to promote similar objectives. With these countries, the government frequently exercises tighter control over unions and labor relations compared to those in developed countries. Several Asian developing countries are experiencing significant economic or political transitions similar to the situation in Eastern Europe. China. The People's Republic of China is a single-party state ruled by the Communist Party of China that legally recognizes only one umbrella labor union organization, the All China Federation of Trade Union. Before the late 1980s, labor relations were similar to the Eastern European Stalinist model. The ACFTU Traditional responsibilities focus on promoting the common national good and social harmony. Since the late 1980s, China's economic system has been transitioning from socialism to a mixed market economy. Labor relation changes have been driven by economic rather than political change. New labor laws were enacted in the mid 1990s to promote collective bargaining. However, workers lack true freedom of association because the ACFTU remains the only legally approved union organization and continues to be closely related to the Communist Party. Workers have used grassroots campaigns and strikes to attempt to gain bargaining power. With the ever-changing political and economic climate in China, their development of their labor relations is one to watch. From this chapter, we learn that there are numerous ways for structuring labor relations. The U.S. emphasis on exclusive representation and majority support is often absent outside of North America. Political strength can result in labor standards that are legislated for all workers rather than confined to workers covered by a collective bargaining agreement. Outside of the U.S., many employment conditions, especially benefits, are established by government regulations. One example is paid vacation, another is job security and at-will employment. Globalization raises a key question for comparative labor relations in the 21st century. The convergence thesis predicts that labor relations practices and policies across countries will converge to a common set of practices and national differences will disappear. Evidence, however, does not support this. In particular, the most important effects of globalization on labor relations are declining union strength and intense corporate pressure for increased workplace flexibility. National level institutions remain important for shaping the response to companies and unions to these pressures. One thing that I found interesting while reading this chapter was how the book mentions that the European Union is a way for Great Britain to achieve labor relations that favor workers and their representatives. We all know since being published, the Brexit has happened and they did vote to leave the EU. So the article I found listed various working rights and benefits that would be changed and that might not be changed due to leaving the EU. So they felt that some things that wouldn't change would be unfair dismissal laws, minimum wages, and equal pay for men and women, and they felt that that was not we didn't have to worry about that because they were laws before joining the EU. And then the article definitely talks about how working time and overtime and compensation caps and agency workers will all definitely be impacted from leaving the EU. So it just made me really think, will leaving the EU have more consequences for British workers? Do we think it's a step positive? Is it a step backwards or is it positive? There just seems to be a trend going away from globalization with Brexit and our current American administration. What impact do you guys think they will have on labor relations globally? Will we make a positive impact for labor policies in countries that are still developing, or are we taking a step back and we will hinder their development? Like, what do you guys think?